evening and welcome to our very own homegrown West Deptford celebration of 250 years since the birth of America. We're glad to see all of you here, and we hope that you're going to enjoy the evening. And since I am not former President Joe Biden, I will not wear my sunglasses to do this. We have with us tonight, well, let me start by introducing myself. That would make a lot more sense. I am Miriam Reichenbach. I'm a former teacher, a former librarian, and the current president of the Friends of the West Deptford Free Public Library. And it is my pleasure to tell you that tonight we have guests with us whom I'm sure you're going to enjoy. Mayor Mahaffey sends his regrets and his best wishes, but he's unable to join us tonight. However, we are privileged to have with us the co-presidents of the West Deptford Historical Society, April Maska, a former teacher, and Noreen Mikulski, a current teacher here in our community. And they're going to talk a little bit about the families that were involved locally with the Revolutionary War. In addition, we have Nancy Barna as Betsy Ross and John Barna as George Washington, who are here among us tonight, and they would be more than happy to pose for photos with anybody who is interested. Thank you so much for being here. Additionally, we're joined by Eric Mollenhauer, another former teacher, and currently the facilitator of the Mantua Grove Citizens Advisory Panel, who is going to talk with you about the battle at the fort. And additionally, we have Ed Komchek, another former teacher, and he is currently the vice chairperson of the Environmental Commission here in West Deptford. And he will speak with you about the battle at the creek, at the creek by our house on Kings Highway. We have the Tri-County Symphonic Band here tonight to provide great music, which we hope you're going to enjoy. And we're just going to take little breaks in between and try and teach you a bit of history. Thank you, Tri-County Symphonic Band. I would be remiss if I didn't thank Colonial Pipeline, and in particular Stan Carpenter, for the support that they gave us in putting this program together. I don't think Stan is here tonight, but I know that he would appreciate knowing that we said thank you, and they were a big help to us, and we were glad that they were able to offer that assistance. And I would also like to say a very special, heartfelt thank you to our township events planner, Lataya Holmes. Lataya, stand up and wave. This program would have been impossible to put together without her assistance. She knows the buttons to push, the people to talk with, and how to get things done. And I certainly appreciate every second she put into making sure that tonight's program works for all of you. Thank you so much, and I do hope that you enjoy the evening.
Good evening. I'm Dr. Ron Willoughby. Had my pleasure to be the director of the Tri-County Symphonic Band, and I am not a teacher. But hopefully you will learn a little bit something about the selections that we're going to play for you this evening. The first of which is one of the last marches that Sousa wrote, and he wrote it for the occasion of the 200th anniversary of the birth of our founding father, George Washington. He's up there 200 years old, Mr. Washington. And breaking the thing out. This is called the George Washington Bicentennial March.
is April Maska, and I'm here this evening with Noreen Mikulski. We co-founded the West Effort Historical Association. Our mission is simple. We work to preserve the rich history of West Effort Township and to share that history with all of you. Tonight we bring you the history of West Effort as it would have been during the American Revolution. It is important to note that this area was a vital defense corridor protecting Philadelphia from the British warships. First of all, West Effort Township did not yet exist. The town wasn't incorporated until 1871. During the Revolution, the area we now call West Effort was part of Bethlehem, which was later incorporated as Deptford Township in 1798. At the time of the Revolution, it was commonplace to refer to places using a family or farm's name or the name of a specific landmark, such as a creek or a fort. General George Washington referred to the area of Red Bank in a letter he wrote to New Jerseyans imploring them to, and I quote, "Rise up as one man and rid your country of its cruel invaders." For the purpose of this evening, we are focusing on the events that would have occurred and the families and farms that would have been in existence during the time of the Revolution within the area of what we now call West Effort. At the time of the Revolution, we know of several homes that are still standing that would have been here at that time. The Reeves Farm and Griscom Farm, both located in Greenfields. Candor Hall, maybe you know it as Ladd's Castle, located on Lafayette Avenue in the Colonial Manor section. The Low Farm, located along the river. At the time of the American Revolution, this area would have been home to several families, some of which still have relatives living here today. Most of these families, the Coopers, Wilkins, Lords, Lowes, Gills, Reeves, and Whitehalls, were Quakers. The war caused great difficulties for these families. First and foremost, Quakers were pacifists, which is a fundamental principle to the Quaker identity. Both sides demanded loyal oaths that could not be sworn on the basis of faith. Failure to take an oath could result in fines. A failure to pay often resulted in a jail sentence. Furthermore, we know that cattle were requisitioned by both the Continental and British armies. Skirmishes along Mantua Creek, as well as the Battle of Fort Mercer, and attacks on the ships in the Delaware would have occurred within a mile or two of these homesteads. On August 8, 1777, the militant took possession of the Woodbury Monthly Meeting House. It was occupied by soldiers and used as barracks and a hospital. Many of the families would have worshipped here. We know from Job Whitehall, son of James and Ann Cooper Whitehall, that in August of 1776, guns fired between noon and 1, and by the following May, cannonading with British warships lasted 3 hours, causing people to get in arms as fast as possible. We also know that part of the Whitehall family, called Red Bank, was seized by the Continental Army for the construction of the earthwork fort named Fort Mercer. Count von Dollop made his headquarters in the home of John Gill, a Quaker elder, and that he was taken across the creek to the Low Farm where he died of his injuries. Some women and children were sent away from the area, while others stayed. Job Whitehall worked with his cousins to save 21 head of cattle, 8 fat cattle, 4 cows, a pair of oxen, 3 steer, a heifer, and 3 calves. But the American soldiers drove 47 sheep belonging to the Whitehalls into the fortification for their own use. We know this from Job's diary and can speculate that other farmers would have suffered the same fate as soldiers marching along the roads bordering their farms. Also critical to the area during the war was the home of Trench Francis, where a battery of guns was located. It is said that the hot shot used to blow up the British ship HMS Augusta and cripple the HMS Merlin, which the crew abandoned and set fire in order to avoid capture, was heated in his own forge on October 23rd, 1777. Other skirmishes affected these families were skirmishes that took place along Mantua Creek. Between November 20th and 27th, 1777, General Charles Cornwallis burned barracks at Mantua Creek while marching from Billingsport to Gloucester. Later, in March of 1778, British Colonel Charles Mahu's troops marched up Salem Road to Mantua Creek Bridge, which was the only place they could cross, and were met by Captain Samuel Hug with artillery and others from the militia. These are the families and farms we have documentation for at this point in time. There may have been others. Our collection is always growing and changing, so we invite anyone to add anything to our collection. In closing, please visit our display in the RiverWinds lobby, where we are happy to talk with you in greater detail about West Effort's role in the birth of our nation. We also have with us at our display Hugh Pfeiffer, who was a descendant of the Lowe family, and Ed Chomsky, who also has a display up there of all revolutionary artifacts. So we invite you, after this beautiful concert is over, to come join us and talk more about West Effort history. Thank you.
Next, we're going to play a very familiar song, which actually the British sang to make fun of the Americans as they sailed in. This is our three settings that Sousa wrote to the familiar piece, Yankee Doodle, which actually pre-existed before the actual revolution. Yes, they were making fun of us at the time when we sang this, and now it's George M. Cohan, who we'll hear from later, used the song as a way of celebrating. I'm a Yankee Doodle dandy. Well, the British were making fun of us when they sang this song. Next, a selection of pieces written by George M. Cohan, who was such a patriot. He tried to get his birth certificate changed to the fact that he was born on July 4th. Well, sadly for him, he was born on July 3rd. Close enough. He really a hero of the American theater, wrote or funded 20 plays on Broadway, and two of which were stories about his life, actually. Yankee Doodle Dandy, starring Jimmy Cagney, and George M., which was in the 1984, I believe. These are some Americana with some familiar tunes written by George M. Cohan. I'm going to close this segment of our performance with a very familiar Battle Hymn of the Republic. This was written in the 1860s, apparently after Julia Ward Howe wrote the music, heard soldiers singing the tune John Brown's Body. She needed a much better agent. She sold this piece to the Atlantic Monthly for $4.
Good evening. I'm Eric Mullenhauer. I feel like West Deptford is a second home because I taught in high school for 15 years, a long, long time ago. I still run into students like Maureen over here. So it's always good to be back. I think you don't really appreciate history until you yourself become history, and I'm rapidly on the way. I'm here to say a few words about Red Bank Battlefield, which is about a half-mile upriver from here. I lived in Gloucester County almost all my life, and I thought I understood what happened there. About 2 years ago, I began to do my own research, and I found out it's way more interesting than most of us know. And I'm going to unfortunately say, in the last 250 years, the interpretation of the battlefield has been very poor and still is. Normally I do a talk for about an hour. I'm going to collapse into 10 minutes, so I'm going to leave a lot out. One of the things I want you to know is that this was not a minor battle. As I grew up in Gloucester County and showed Red Bank Battlefield to people from other countries, I felt almost embarrassed, like, you know, it's this little postage stamp battlefield. Gosh, I wish I could take you to Saratoga or to Valley Forge or to Trenton or to Yorktown, Virginia, where all the big things happen. Well, actually, this was no small thing, what happened here. And it's connected to all those other things because the fort defenders, most of them who faced 2,000 Hessians, were from Rhode Island. Washington at that point had been defeated at Brandywine, had given up Philadelphia. The British occupied Philadelphia. General Howe was there with about 17,000 troops. He needed to get rid of that fort a half mile up the river, Fort Mercer we call it. And so he sent 2,000 Hessian troops across the river. But let's back up a minute to the previous year, December 1776. George Washington was defeated the Hessians were defeated at Trenton. Washington had lost battle after battle in New York City, retreated across New Jersey, and on the Christmas night attacked Trenton. There was a colonel named Carl von Donop who was the senior officer at Trenton. There was a Trenton barracks with 1,500 troops in it. Carl von Donop had another 2,000 troops. He was stationed at Bordentown. He was the senior commanding officer. He outranked everybody else in those two garrisons. He had decided some days before December 25th, before Christmas, to go south to Mount Holly and skirmished with the New Jersey militia. He meant to go just for a few days, but he stayed, continued to skirmish, and on December 25th, he spent the night with a widow. I have a really interesting book here that you should take a look at sometime. It's called Diary of the American War, a Hessian journal. It was written by Captain Johann Ewald, who was basically special forces back then. We would have called them Green Berets or something, right? In the Hessian troops that Carl von Donop had, Ewald led a group of sharpshooters, the special forces. He kept a diary during the entire war. He was in it from the beginning. Okay, closer or what? Okay, louder and closer. He kept a journal through the entire war. He was there at all the major battles, including Red Bank, and including when Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown, Virginia. He wrote about the Red Bank battle. He said basically, when Carl von Donop spent that night with the widow in Mount Holly, that was what cost King George the 13, as he called them, splendid colonies. He said, and I'm quoting Captain Ewald, Von Donop spent the night with an exceedingly beautiful young widow. He was detained by love, causing the loss of the 13 splendid colonies. And then he goes on to say, thus the fate of entire nations rests on a few blockheads. Who was this widow? There's a well-known New Jersey historian who believes it was none other than Betsy Ross. When I grew up, Betsy Ross was pictured as this elderly, matronly woman sewing the flag. No. In 1776, when Von Donop spent the evening with a exceedingly beautiful widow, Betsy Ross was 22 years old. She had just become a widow. She'd married 2 years before to John Ross. The New Jersey historian believes that Alexander Ross, who lived in Mount Holly, was probably John Ross's cousin. We don't know for sure that it was Betsy Ross who entertained Carl Von Donop that night, but we do know that a young widow did, whether it was on purpose, a spy, to detain him. Because you see, if he'd been at Bordentown, he would have only been 8 miles from Trenton. He would have heard the cannon fire. But Mount Holly is about 22 miles away, and so he was not there. As a result, Von Donop was humiliated. He'd been out of position. And so when General Howe in Philadelphia said, go get rid of this fort, Von Donop volunteered with his 2,000 troops because he had something to prove. They came across the river. It took a whole day to get 2,000 troops across the river. They spent the night in Haddonfield. They got up at 4 in the morning, came south. Unfortunately, the New Jersey militia had taken out the bridge, just a wooden plank bridge. So they removed the planks, which meant that Von Donop's men had to go out of their way to the next bridge up at Clemens Bridge Road. And it meant that they got there late in the day. He basically told Christopher Green, the colonel leading the Rhode Island troops, surrender now or we'll kill you all. They knew that was no idle threat because when the Hessians attacked in Brooklyn Heights in New York City, even when the American troops tried to surrender, they bayoneted them. So I need you to picture for a minute, well, let me step back just 1 second. Picture a famous painting. You all know it, Washington crossing the Delaware. What do we see? We see 3 men standing in the boat with all the ice blocks around, like that seems improbable, right? But the painting was basically a metaphor painted by a German-American artist in 1849, and he was trying to represent the promise of America, trying to represent who won the revolution. So in the boat, there are 13 people, right? 13 colonies, 13 states. Of course, Washington is going to stand tall because he's the leader of the country, the leader of the revolution. And next to him, James Monroe, who later becomes a president. And the third person who's standing, honestly, I don't know who it is. But let's look for a minute at the people in the boat. At the front of the boat, pushing an iceberg out of the way, is a guy with a coonskin hat. He represents a frontiersman because the frontiersmen were part of the making of this country. Next to the frontiersman in the shadows is a black man, an African American. Next to the African American, there's an immigrant. He has a tam o' shanter on his head. He's basically a Scotsman. Behind them is a woman. Really, look at the painting sometime more carefully. There's a woman in the boat, in midships. Behind them, at the rear of the boat, is a Native American with moccasins on and a feather in his cap. The painter was showing us that it took all these people. It was already a diverse nation at that time. In fact, 30 to 50% of the guys who fought for the American cause were immigrants. Depends on which historian you talk to, but at least 3, if not every other fighter in the Continental Army was an immigrant. We've always been a nation of immigrants. So, Karl von Donop brings his 2,000 troops across the river, tells them, surrender or we'll kill you all. Now I need you to picture for a minute this fort. It was designed for 2,000 people, 2,000 defenders. Washington couldn't afford that many. He was still licking his wounds over there outside of Philadelphia. And so he called for the Rhode Island troops to come down from the northern New Jersey area. 500 troops get there less than 2 weeks before the battle, and a fort that's been designed to be defended by 2,000 people. Impossible. So what does Washington do? He sends over a French engineer. We didn't have engineers, military engineers in this country. The best military engineers came from France. Unfortunately, Washington had 2 good ones. Thaddeus Kosciuszko, a Polish guy who planned the fort originally, but then when the battle comes and there's only 500 men, he sends a French engineer, Duplessis is his last name, to redesign the fort. Less than 2 weeks, the Rhode Islanders get there, and they've got less than 2 weeks to redesign the fort. They do it. Von Donop says, surrender or we'll kill you all. So this is where I need you to picture again something in your mind. You're pretty high up there. We're pretty low down. You know, Fort Mercer up there at the park, it sits on a knoll, a high knoll, and then they would have built parapets of dirt higher. So you're kind of sitting on the fort. I want you to imagine, I don't think there's 500 of you, but there's a couple hundred maybe out here. I want you to imagine you're the defenders of the fort, and coming at you are 2,000 men with bayonets charging towards you. Pretty scary proposition. When that happens, do you care if the person next to you is black or Native American, Christian, Muslim, a woman? You don't care. You care that that person has your back, because that's the only way you're going to survive. In fact, there were at least 60 men of the 500 that were there who were black, Native American, or mixed race, plus a French engineer and a fort designed by a Polishman. This was a diverse story right from the beginning. And if it ever gets told the right way, it's going to be an amazing movie, an amazing story, because they won that battle, right? In 30 minutes at that fort, Karl von Donop lost 1/4 of his army, either killed, wounded, or captured. He himself died some days later. He was captured by the Americans. He died some days later at the Low Farm. So it's a story of arrogance, right? Because he thought, like, I can redeem myself for the mistakes I made. No, you shouldn't have attacked just before dark, because you rolled the dice, and if it doesn't come up right, you're done. But the thing is this, we've always been a diverse country. And as long as we have each other's back, that's been our greatest strength. It's on our money, right? E pluribus unum. Out of many, one. One nation, one people, one destiny. It was that way then, it's that way now. Thank you very much.
Next, we're going to play a march which actually celebrates our French allies. For the first time, Sousa's band went overseas in 1900 to the Paris Exposition, at which place, a statue which was actually a gift from the Children of America to honor Lafayette's contribution to the Revolution. Seuss was happy to write a march for this occasion. It's called Hail to the Spirit of Liberty.